wisdom was going to be it. So he tried to find wisdom, but in the end it came up. His problem was onefold. He tried to find wisdom in this world. And you can't find wisdom in this world that God talks about in the Bible. And so he said in the end, if you look at the end of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, turn over there, he said in 18, he said, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." And he said basically it's vanity. It's not worth anything. So, okay, he's trying to live the kind of life that is profitable for a king. So he says, well, it's not in wisdom. Let me try something else. So in chapter 2, he tries pleasure. And if you look in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good." But that also proved to be meaningless. So he thought, well, if it's not wisdom, surely it's pleasure. That's going to satisfy me. That's going to give my life fulfillment. If I can just do whatever pleases me, whatever makes me feel good is what I'm going to do. Now, you have to give Solomon a little credit here, okay? In his all-out search for meaning in life. What is the meaning in life? Once he found out one thing, wisdom's not, that didn't satisfy him. He turned to something else. So he turned to the human variety. And he tried to see what he can do and come up with pleasure-wise. And that's what chapter 2 is talking about, is Solomon's search for meaning in life through pleasure. Okay? Now, what we talk about pleasure is anything that comes to mind that makes you feel good. Okay? And that's kind of the approach that Solomon took. Hey, we're there. Yay! All right, so he said, "I will test you with pleasure." Okay, he became I think it's pronounced hedonist, Hedonist. And that's a person who does nothing but seeks pleasure for themselves. That's all that they look for. What makes me feel good? And that's their main focus. That's all they care about, is feeling good. Well, I feel good. This makes me feel great. I feel wonderful. But all they look for are those things that give them that pleasure in their mind. He says in verse 10, chapter 2, "And all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor." Okay? So, notice, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. Now, you have to think, that might take some money. I mean, you're just not going to go out and just get things for free. I mean, you can't do that now. You certainly couldn't do it back then either. So, but that wasn't a problem for Solomon, remember? God gave him riches above what anybody else was going to have. Okay, so how much riches or wealth did Solomon have? Well, turn back to 1 Kings and look at chapter 10. And we'll just see how rich Solomon was. Look beginning in verse 14. "The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders that from the Arabian kings and the governors of the land. So now you wonder, well, how much is 666 talents? Because we don't deal in that terminology today. Okay, I looked that up. Blew me away. Yearly, he received 49 tons of gold. That's a lot of gold. Okay. 16, King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 bakas of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold with 3 minas of gold in each shield. The king put them in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. Then the king made a great throne inlaid with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's goblets were gold. All the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned carrying gold, silver, and ivory, and apes and baboons. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom Solomon had put in his heart. Remember, he asked God for wisdom, and God granted him that, plus all this other stuff. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Cush. The royal merchants purchased them from Cush. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the Armenians. So you can see that money was not a problem, okay, for Solomon. Matter of fact, no matter whatever he wanted, he was going to get. And if you look back up earlier in chapter 10, you notice it mentions that people were soughting audiences to come see him and hear of his wisdom. One of those who did that was Queen of Sheba, Queen Sheba. Now, in 6 through 8, she talks about her visit with him and talked to him, and she said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report." So even what it was told about, he had a lot more than anybody could ever tell people about. Can you imagine being so rich and have so much that anybody could not accurately tell people how much you had? No matter what people imagine, it's more than that. I mean, if you got 44 tons of gold coming in per year, you're going to be in pretty good shape. But now you got all this other stuff that comes in. So he's not a problem with him going out and looking for whatever he wanted, to get. So basically, if it felt good, he did it. That's our next point. If it looked good, he bought it. If it sounded good, he went for it. In other words, he lived the American dream to the fullest, long before there was an America. If you think about it, that's kind of the way we live today. That's the way people in society kind of think about it. If it feels good, let's do it. If it looks good, I'm going to buy it. And if it sounded good, I'm going to go for it. That's the American dream. to have what I want that makes me feel good and look good. All right, so he did that. He looked for everything that was going to do that. Okay, so what were specific things that he went for? Well, that kind of brings us up to the next slide. What was the extent of his pleasure test? Well, that's kind of in the first 8 verses there of chapter 2. And it specifies the kinds of pleasure which he experienced. First was laughter. And I thought that was interesting. He went in pleasure, laughter. Well, it's kind of strange for me for all the other pleasures that existed, I thought. But he said of laughter, it is madness. Evidently, Solomon sought to lose himself in fun and games. Whatever would give him a laugh, he did. No matter what it was. If it was fun, great. He did it. Well, that didn't work. So second, he tried wine. Okay? He said, I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine. So like a lot of people today, Solomon looked for contentment at the bottom of a bottle. And even though he indulged in drinking, his mind was still guiding him wisely, okay, with the wisdom that God had given him. Apparently, that meant that he sought to remain in control. Okay, he didn't get drunk where he didn't know what was going on or what he was doing, and perhaps it was to gauge whether or not wine was giving him what he looked for. But it did not in the end. No, he didn't see that. Third, that didn't work, so he tried real estate. Okay. Solomon mentions houses, vineyards, parks, gardens, pools, anything that he could think of, real estate-wise, he indulged in. He indulged in lands and building projects, and that's how ancient kings typically showed their wealth and their splendor. In other words, their real estate holdings served as status symbols. A little bit, like today. The bigger your house, the more status you have, Depending on where you live, you might have a play in that to what people think your status is. So, he tried laughter, it didn't work. Tried wine, didn't work. So, he went to real estate and tried bigger and better. Thought, well, that's it. That didn't work. So, he tried a fourth thing. And that was money and possessions. Surely that's going to be it. He specifies in there that he owned many slaves, owned a lot of livestock, silver, gold, and other treasures. And in there it says, larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Notice he didn't say just one. It's larger than anyone, all combined, who preceded me in Jerusalem. He was buying into that belief that wealth brings happiness. And that's an age-old one. That's nothing new for us today. That's been that way since Solomon's time and before. If you want happiness, it's in wealth. It's in money. It's in possessions. How much are you worth? The higher up you go, the more status you have, the more happiness you'll have. A person who has $1 million is going to be happier than someone who has 100,000, but someone who has $1 billion is going to be happier than a millionaire. That's the age-old belief to have happiness. But I found an interesting stat a couple of years ago, and I was looking at this, and we were talking about teenagers as well, and some of the problems that teenagers are having growing up in today's society with all things that they're bombarded with for happiness, really. And, they end up being unhappy because they find out it's not what it's supposed to be. And let me just ask you, what group do you think has the largest percentage of suicide in the U.S.? Anybody got a guess?
People with the most money.
Do what?
People with the most money.
Okay, exactly right. The number one group that leads the U.S. in suicides is millionaires. Not kids, not teenagers, not homeless, not people struggling, millionaires. And the reason that they gave in this study that they found out was they never could be satisfied. They never could have enough. Once they reached $1 million, they wanted 2 million. Once they got to 2 million, they weren't satisfied until they got to 3. So they were never satisfied, and they couldn't get satisfied. So a lot of them chose suicide because they couldn't ever get where they wanted to be. They couldn't find happiness because they were never satisfied. Well, Solomon gave it all he had in order to find out, and it didn't work. Okay. So money and possessions wasn't it. Is there anything else to do? Well, one final try. Fifth was sex. That's surely going to bring me happiness, going to bring me pleasure. Solomon said he got for himself the pleasures of men, many concubines. But if you look at 1 Kings 11 and verse 3, a little bit more detail there. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. 700 wives. Can't imagine. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine 2. Much less 700. Good grief. I mean, every conceivable erotic pleasure was at his disposal. And he apparently tried them all. And they brought him pleasure, but it's not the kind of pleasure he was looking for. Okay? So he thought, this is the answer. This finally is what I've been looking for. But what he found out was, look in verse 11 of chapter 2. Thus I considered all my activities, okay, which my hands had done, and the labor which I exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind. There was no profit under the sun. Okay? So think about that for a minute. Okay? He tried laughter, wine, real estate, money, possessions, sex. None of that satisfied him. It did not last. And it's like wisdom. He called wisdom vanity. Pleasure was vanity. But if you look at our world today, we're not unlike Solomon here in the pleasure thing. We're pleasure addicts in today's world. We cannot get enough thrills. We need bigger and more exotic fixes to keep us going. And the problem is, it doesn't last. You get one fix and it's temporary. Then you got to go get another one, and sometimes you got to have more. And you just keep going and going because there's no satisfaction that's complete. It doesn't leave you. It doesn't stay with you. It leaves you. The Bible doesn't say that sin is never pleasurable. Some sin, and some of Solomon's pleasures obviously were sinful. But the real problem with his sensual pleasure was what? What happened with it? Yeah, turned him away from God, led him away from God. And that's what happened. When we seek pleasure to get satisfaction, to get happiness, a lot of the time it leads us away from God. It turns us away. It means that we're looking in the wrong direction. If we want a full life, it's not going to be through pleasure, because that's going to leave you empty inside. And you've got to look, I think you've got to look inside for that. Any comments, questions, thoughts at this point?
I wonder about what he had observed in his father and his mother and their family. That his father had multiple wives.
Yeah.
And then saw Bathsheba, man who had everything. And yet Solomon lived in a dysfunctional family where one brother decided to rape his sister.
Yeah.
That brother was murdered by a brother. And yet he was granted, and it was talked about earlier in the series, secular wisdom. But he's able to write this book, maybe late in his life, but as a young person, he saw and heard things that evidently influenced him with making poor decisions later on in his life.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I wonder to some extent if it's perhaps, like we are sometimes. Well, I know the mistake they made. I'm not going to make that mistake.
Everything is better if you get more. I remember when ESPN came out, I thought that was great.
Yeah.
In the 1970s.
Yeah.
Well, then we got ESPN 2.
Yeah.
Now I find out I got to pay extra money to get ESPN Plus, Disney Plus.
Yeah.
It's this mentality. You just don't need a hamburger. You need a quarter pounder or a half pounder. It's just this mentality that we think not only is it better, we deserve to get more.
Yes.
And maybe I need a whole lot less and would be just as happy.
Yeah. Well, and you're right. If you watch TV, I guess 98% of the commercials are what type of commercials? You need this to keep up. You need this to be satisfied. You need this bigger, better, more expensive, whatever it is. And guess what our kids are watching? Those commercials. They'll watch a lot of TV, they're going to watch those commercials, and they hear over again, you need this because it's bigger, it's better. You can't be satisfied unless you have this. Unless you own this. Unless you have the latest edition of this, you're missing out with your phone. Or you need this type of car, or you need this type of clothes to wear, because that's the in thing. That's going to give you happiness, to be in the in crowd. You're going to have the pleasure. And it's us too. I grew up in a world where my father said, I want my son to have it better than I have it. Okay? And that's been the way for generations after generations in America. I want my children to have it better than I had it. And that was the goal. When you look at the year 2021, I'm not sure if it's ever going to be better. I don't know if you're raising kids now, if you can say, I want it to be better, because I'm not sure if it's ever going to be better than it has been, in the last few years. Even though we've had the pandemic, even though we've had that. So, it's just one of those things that I think that you get bombarded with and we get tied up into and we get caught up in that idea of pleasure and happiness. And that's what Solomon was trying to do. He was trying to figure this thing out. And he said, I want a happy life. I want a full life. What's the best life for me to live? And he said, well, it wasn't wisdom. So now he's trying pleasure, and he's finding out it's kind of the same result. Has happened. So, the lessons from his pleasure test. What do we get from there? What do we learn from there, from Solomon? Well, one is, or first, that sensual pleasures make promises that lead nowhere. Okay? Recently, I saw a bumper sticker somewhere on a car that said, "In search of the eternal buzz." We cherish the notion of ultimate pleasure, lasting pleasure, pleasure that will give us permanent happiness and fulfillment. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist. A lot of people today live only for pleasure, actually find only a series of fun fixes that go away.
It only exists in heaven.
Yeah, exactly. But they're looking in the wrong place. They're totally off base with what they're looking for. Others are caught up in blind pursuit of pleasure. That's all they see. They can't think correctly. They can't think right. And in reality, endless pleasure or endless pursuit of pleasure only blinds us as to what is important about life that Bernie was talking about. An important part of life is living your life so you can get to heaven.
See, you have to. It's a book on heaven by Alcorn. C-O-R-N. He has it.
Yeah.
It's a digested book, and he has a lot of it. And it's the best thing I've seen.
Yeah. And what part of the problem is, I think that people who are going in this direction pretend that everything's good, and then those around us kind of join in the game because no one wants to admit that they're really dying inside. Nobody really wants to admit that this is not what I thought it was, I spent so much in here, I spent so much of my time, I talk about how great this is. Well, I don't want to admit that it's not the thing. And it ends up being a tragic game for people, unfortunately. All right. The pursuit of happiness eventually leads us to neglect God and to allow pleasure to actually become our God. And that's where the problem is. That's what we start idolizing. All right, second lesson. Sensual pleasures disillusion us and make cover-up artists of us. And that's what I was talking about just a second ago. You get it, you do it so much, it's the emphasis, it's the center of your life. You don't want to admit, it's hard to admit that that's not working. That it's not what you thought it would be, right? I mean, as sinner, that's the way it is. It's hard to come up and come to Christ and admit what I've been doing is not working. I'm wrong. It's hard for us to say, for us to admit I'm wrong. But that's exactly what's happening. People are centered on pleasure. They turn away from God, and they don't want to admit that God is the answer. Because they put so much time, so much money, so much effort into the pleasure thing, it's hard to say, I was wrong. I messed up. So we start covering up. Oh, yeah, everything's great, man. This is super. You need to try this. This is fantastic. While inside, they don't feel that way. And they cover that up. Number 3, The enjoyment of life is a personal gift from God. That's the key one right there. The enjoyment of life is a personal gift from God. And Solomon admits that. Look in chapter 2, verses 24 through 26, as it's up there on the screen. It says, "There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This also is vanity and striving after wind." How do you want to find true meaning in life? Put God in the center of your life. Follow God. Solomon learned to his dismay that he could not make himself happy. Key lessons, people. We cannot make ourselves happy. God gives us genuine and lasting satisfaction in life. The only way you're going to find true happiness in life, and what Solomon's saying, is in God. And think about that. He's saying nothing is better than to eat, drink, and find enjoyment. He's not recommending some kind of worldly lifestyle. He's recommending the enjoyment of what God gives us. Just like He gives us salvation. It's a gift. It's not anything we earned. Enjoyment is a gift from God. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to enjoy life. But the only way we can fully enjoy life and have contentment is in God. So if you have enjoyment in your life, be thankful. And if not, recognize that you're possibly looking for it in the wrong place. Okay, the fourth lesson. Instead of pursuing pleasure, we ought to pursue life. Solomon acknowledges his basic error in verse 1. He said he pursued pleasure for his own sake, and that seems to be the setting error of our times. We're pleasure addicts. But if you want happiness, you got to pursue life, pursue God, pursue better relationships with your family, pursue meaningful work, pursue service to others. Then pleasure in life will be God's gift to you, as it was to Solomon. Okay. Slide 6. Sooner or later, you have to face to the kind of lifestyle you choose. Do we believe that we can consistently abuse our bodies and not pay the price for that abuse? Can we reject God and not pay the price? Can we neglect our families and not pay the price? Can we indulge in sin and not pay the price? No. Paying the price is what the whole idea of judgment is all about. What we do here on this earth. We come to face with God. Is it good or is it bad? That's when we start paying for what we live here on this earth. And then the last slide, the conclusion, I'll finish up quickly. Solomon had to face up to the life he was living sooner or later, just as we will have to face up. So have you faced your need for Jesus Christ? Pleasure is no substitute for God's gift of genuine happiness. If it is no substitute for being able to finally face God with confidence and joy. Solomon thought he had some answers here, thought he could find out the real meaning in life. And surely it's in pleasure. It's not. The true meaning in life is to live a life in God. If you do that, then the happiness, the contentment is a byproduct. You know, think about that. Sometimes you can be happy but not content. God gives you both, happiness and contentment. It's the only way you're going to get it. That's what Solomon ends up. That's the lessons I think he gives us there in chapter 2. Thank you for your attendance today. Thank you for joining us online if you did. We'll have worship service in a few minutes. Thank you.